Samuel Morse is probably a rather familiar name to many of us in this room. He, of course, is noted as being the inventor of the telegraph and the Morse code. He was also quite an accomplished painter. One day he was reportedly asked by a friend if he ever came to a standstill when it came to his inventions. "Oh yes," Mr. Morse told him, "more than once." The friend then asked him what he did under those circumstances when his brain just kind of, he couldn't think anymore. He just came to a dead end. What did he do then? Mr. Morse replied, "Whenever I could not see my way clearly, I prayed for more light." "And the light generally came?" the friend asked. "Oh yes," Mr. Morse replied. "And may I tell you that when flattering honors came to me from the invention which bears my name, I never felt I deserved them. I had made a valuable application of electricity, not because I was superior to other men, but solely because God, who meant it for mankind, must reveal it to someone and was pleased to reveal it to me." That story was from 2,000 plus Bible illustrations and serves to introduce the subject of this message. You could call this the perils of pride and the honor of humility. The perils of pride and the honor of humility. Today we'll look at a few examples from the pages of the Bible of people who showed those two contrasting character traits. What can we learn from these examples? Well, let's find out. Well, while David is considered a man after God's own heart and a hero of faith, he was certainly not perfect. No one is. But one of David's most apparent shortcomings related to his family. His family life was quite messy. One example of that relates to one of David's sons, Adonijah. Adonijah was David's fourth son. In 1 Kings 1, verse 5, we get a little bit of a glimpse into the kind of person that Adonijah was. 1 Kings 1, verse 5. "And Adonijah, the son of Haggith," was one of David's wives, "exalted himself, saying, I will be king." Notice that. He exalted himself. He elevated himself to the position of king. He did not allow God to raise him to that position. He simply took it upon himself. And as it turned out, he had a somewhat legitimate claim to the throne, but that did not give him the right to take over as king. He decided that he would set himself up as the next ruler over Israel. He might have thought that David, his father and king at that time, really didn't know what was going on, really wouldn't notice that he had taken over. On the other hand, perhaps he did it so blatantly in order to rub it in his father's face, as it were. He also lined up chariots and horsemen, 50 runners. Notice the last part of verse 5. "And he prepared himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him." Now Absalom, Adonijah's now deceased older half-brother, did the same thing. There was one problem with Adonijah's plan, though. That was, he was not chosen to be king. God, through David, had already chosen Solomon as successor to the throne. But that didn't stop Adonijah, though. He thought that he should be king, and he wanted to be king, and he appointed himself accordingly. Now, Adonijah apparently was a rather good-looking man, and he knew it, and he knew that he could use that to his advantage. David did not question Adonijah about his intention to become king. By this time, David was aging, and his health was failing. Perhaps he simply did not have the strength to deal with the situation. Regardless, it appears that Adonijah got his way once again. It should be noted that Absalom was born to a different mother, Maacah, even though both Adonijah and Absalom shared some similar characteristics with one another. Matthew Henry states the following in his commentary on the whole Bible. He writes that children who are indulged learn to be proud and ambitious, which is the ruin of a great many young people. And that certainly applied to Adonijah. In order to gain support for his idea to take the throne and to start a following, Adonijah met with Joab and Abiathar, as noted in verse 7. 1 Kings 1, verse 7. And he talked to Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar, the priest. And they helped or surrounded and protected Adonijah, following him. So who were these two people, Joab and Abiathar? Joab was perhaps most famous for killing Uriah. Uriah, of course, was the husband of Bathsheba. And Bathsheba, as we realize, was the woman with whom David committed adultery, among many other things. Abiathar was the priest, as stated in verse 7 that we just read. So like Joab, Abiathar also had dealings with David. Both men sided with Adonijah, though, and followed him in his quest for the throne. Now, obviously, God does not condone rebellion, but he does give us choices, just as Adonijah was given a choice, and Joab and Abiathar had their choices as well. And their choice was to do what was right in their own eyes. Not everyone sided with Adonijah, though. Not everyone thought that he had the right to claim the throne. There were those who stood up against him. In verse 8, 1 Kings 1, but Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shemaiah, and Ray, and David's mighty men were not with Adonijah. Now these people held high positions within David's administration and were close to David. And they were loyal to him, to David, who was a king and ruler at that time. Zadok and Abiathar were both priests who worked together under David for quite some time. Later on, Zadok replaced Abiathar when Abiathar decided to follow Adonijah and his quest for the throne. Benaiah also held a high position under David. He was apparently one of David's bodyguards, perhaps the chief bodyguard. And Nathan was the one who confronted David about his sins with Bathsheba and Uriah. Shemaiah, he is an interesting person. If you go back to 2 Samuel 16, verse 5, you read that he cursed David when he came to Bahurim. That was in relation to Absalom's rebellion. Later, Shimei repented, and even though David was perhaps somewhat suspicious of his motives, he nonetheless accepted him into his inner circle. Ray, R-E-I, Ray is only mentioned once in the Bible, and this is in this verse that we just read. So the fact that he's mentioned as being loyal to David indicates that he also held a high position, although it is not listed what that position was. But David's mighty men were not named, but were quite possibly the most essential element of his standing army, as Albert Barnes states in his notes on the Bible. So Adonijah's sympathizers grew in number, and then he decided to throw a party for them in verse 9. And Adonijah killed sheep and oxen and fat cattle by the stone of Zeholeth, or the stone of serpents, which is by En-rogel, and called all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. Perhaps this feast was a foretaste of the kind of feast that Adonijah would put on when he became king. One commentary states this might have been the actual feast itself to inaugurate himself as the king. Now, he was quite premature in his celebration, but that didn't seem to matter. It didn't matter at all to Adonijah. There was absolutely no sign of humility in Adonijah. His ego was enlarged, and it just kept on growing. After all, he made himself king. And in doing so, he was going directly against the will of God. Verse 10 is interesting because it lists who was not present at that feast Verse 10, but he did not call Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, and the mighty men, and Solomon his brother. So these were some of the people noted in verse 8 who remained loyal to David and realized that Adonijah had no right to take over the throne. Solomon had been added to the list as well. And Solomon, we realize, was the one, in fact, chosen by God to be next in line for the throne. But again, these details didn't stop Adonijah. In verse 11, notice Nathan's words. And Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, have you not heard Adonijah, the son of Haggith, reigns, and David our Lord does not know? So Solomon, the rightful heir to the throne, was the son of Bathsheba. Because of David's age and health, he quite possibly was not entirely aware of what was going on. But because David did not deal with this situation properly earlier on, it escalated to the point where one of his sons was pitted against another, yet again. This was a problem, systemic, in David's family. We might have done something similar to what David did here. You know, as humans, we tend to put off unpleasant tasks. Sometimes we think if we ignore a problem long enough, it will either go away or it will resolve itself. But more often than not, the opposite happens. It just gets bigger, as it did here. The problem escalates into something much, much larger. And the larger it became, the more difficult it became to resolve. And that's just like life today. We put off our problems, and they get bigger, they get more difficult to resolve. Nathan, once again, got more involved in the situation with Adonijah. He was put in the middle of a situation that he probably would rather not be in. Of course, remember how he confronted David about his sin with Bathsheba. Probably did not want to do that either. But since God told him that he had to do so, he did it with the comfort of knowing that God was behind him. Like David and Bathsheba, Nathan saw that something was wrong in the situation with Adonijah, and it needed to be addressed. Could not go on much longer. So he suggested to Bathsheba that she talk to David about the crisis. Verse 13, go up and go into King David and say to him, my lord, O king, did you not swear to your handmaid, saying, surely your son Solomon shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne? Why then does Adonijah reign? The next few verses, David is brought up to speed by Bathsheba about Adonijah's intentions and his antics. Nathan then came into the room with David and Bathsheba in verse 22 as previously arranged. Verse 23 tells us something noteworthy here. Verse 23. And they, that is, those who were in or near the king's chambers, told the king, saying, behold Nathan the prophet. And he came in before the king and bowed before the king, with his face to the ground. Now verse 16, which we did not read, but if we go back to verse 16, it shows that Bathsheba did the same thing. She did something similar. That is, she showed proper reverence to the office of the ruler. And verse 31, she did the same thing again. It's safe to say that Adonijah would not have done that. David was still a king. Solomon was the heir to the throne, but Adonijah took matters into his own hands, and thus forcing David to set Solomon in place as king, perhaps somewhat prematurely. Adonijah forced David's hand, in effect. In verse 34, the process to install Solomon as David's successor began. Verse 39, it was made official. Let's read that. Verse 39 of 1 Kings chapter 1. And Zadok the priest took a horn of oil out of the tabernacle and anointed Solomon. And they blew the ram's horn, and all the people said, let King Solomon live. There was much feasting in the land when Solomon became king. This was a very public display that was very difficult to ignore. Verse 40, and all the people came up after him, and the people piped with pipes and rejoiced with great joy, so that the earth was torn with their sound. Now, something that was pretty hard to ignore. In the meanwhile, Adonijah continued with his feast until he heard the sounds that we just described in verse 40. In verse 41, and Adonijah heard, and all the invited guests with him, and they stopped eating. And Joab heard the sound of the ram's horn and said, what is this noise roaring from the city? So it must have been quite a loud sound. And while he was still speaking, and behold, Jonathan, the son of Abiathar the priest, came. And Adonijah said to him, come in, for you are a mighty man, or a man of valor, and you bring good news. There seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between those last two statements. What does being a mighty man of valor have to do with bringing good news? Perhaps those words were spoken with a touch of sarcasm. But then Jonathan delivered the message to Adonijah that Solomon was king, and not him. The guests at Adonijah's feast showed how committed they were upon hearing the news. Verse 49 states that they were afraid and they left. So much for his supporters. Adonijah then became afraid himself. He knew that he had usurped power. He knew that he did not have his father David's blessing. And he knew that his supporters would no longer follow him. And verse 50 tells us what he did next. In verse 50 of 1 Kings 1, and Adonijah feared because of Solomon, and arose and went and caught hold of the horns of the altar. It's likely that he went into the altar to seek refuge. In the meantime, word got back to Solomon, the new king, and he offered something to Adonijah with one condition. Verse 52. And Solomon said, if he becomes a son of virtue, that is referring to Adonijah, if he becomes a son of virtue, not a hair of his head shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness shall be found in him, then he shall die. Solomon then had Adonijah removed from the altar, sent him home to deal with him later. He was given a reprieve of sorts. Basically, if you change your ways, then we'll deal with that. But if you don't, then there will be consequences. The next chapter of 1 Kings notes David's death. Adonijah then went to meet Bathsheba. Remember how she was Solomon's mother. Notice chapter 2 and verse 15 of 1 Kings. Chapter 2 and verse 15. And he said, you know that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel set their faces on me that I should reign. However, the kingdom is turned around and has become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. Adonijah pleaded his case with Bathsheba. Notice, however, that he did not admit that he was wrong in his quest to become king. He did not offer any sort of apology for his behavior. He rightfully pointed out that he should have been successor to the throne as the oldest living son of David. And he further pointed out that he was the popular choice for king among the people. He did concede that Solomon was to be king through God, though. But through all this, Adonijah did not show any sign of repentance at all for his actions. Instead, there was an ulterior motive to his meeting with Bathsheba. In verse 17, and he said, please speak to Solomon the king, for he will not turn away your face, that he give me Abishag the Shunamite for my wife. Now, Abishag was David's attendant in his old age. You can see that back in the previous chapter, chapter 1 or verse 15. So Bathsheba then took Adonijah's request to Solomon. King Solomon answered and said to his mother, and why do you ask Abishag the Shunamite for Adonijah? Ask the kingdom for him. For he is my older brother. Even for him, and for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. Now in those days, certain things were passed on from one king to the next. The new king would inherit the property and the people from the king that he succeeded. In this case, Abishag was considered royal property, and she was thus became Solomon's property. Now, Adonijah's request was seen as another attempt to take over the throne. It was another sign of rebellion in Adonijah. It was an act of treason. Another strike against Adonijah was to use Bathsheba to make the request for Abishag. He didn't want to face Solomon himself, so he used his mother. But that, as it turned out, was Adonijah's last chance. Verse 24. And now as the king lives, who has established me and set me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house, as he spoke, Adonijah shall be put to death today. It is interesting to note the parallels between the parable that Nathan told David about the poor man's lamb back in 2 Samuel 12 and the deaths of four of David's sons. In that story that Nathan told David, to recall that David stated the man who took the poor man's lamb should pay fourfold for his death. The Bible records explicitly the deaths of four of David's sons. The one who died after being born to Bathsheba, after David's adultery with her. Amnon, who died at the hand of Absalom. Absalom himself, who died at the hand of Joab. And Adonijah, who was ordered killed by Solomon. So what can we learn from Adonijah and this example? Perhaps the most important lesson is that we must never put ourselves into a position of authority when we don't belong there. We must never put ourselves into positions of authority when we don't belong there. Pride has its price. Remember, Adonijah exalted himself to be king, as we read 1 Kings 1, verse 5. He exalted himself to be the king. We would do well to heed the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 18, verse 14. Luke chapter 18 and verse 14. Luke chapter 18, verse 14. Let's look at the last part of this verse first. Adonijah would have been well to know these words. Luke 18, verse 14, the last part of the verse. For everyone who exalts himself shall be abased, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted. Those words were part of a parable that Jesus told about two men who went to the temple to pray. Let's take a look at this example, see what we can learn from it. Going back a few verses, let's read the parable beginning in verse 9 of Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 9. Let's see what we can learn from this example. Luke 18, verse 9, and he spoke this parable to certain ones who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Although Jesus directed this parable to a certain group of people, we can all learn from it. We should be avoiding those characteristics of trusting in ourselves, of being self-righteous, and of despising others. They're all part of pride. Obviously, this was a problem, otherwise there would be no reason for Jesus to tell the parable. Continuing on in verse 10. Two men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. At that time, Pharisees were known to be proud and self-righteous. They looked down on the common people. They thought that they were up at a higher level. The next verses prove this point. Verse 11, the Pharisee stood and prayed within or by himself in this way. God, I thank you that I am not like other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Verse 12, I fast twice on the Sabbath, and I give tithes of all that I possess. Now some commentaries note that in verse 11, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, not wanting contact with ordinary people. That was just part of the way that they were. They saw themselves as being apart from everyone else, of being on a higher level than anyone else. They saw themselves as being better than others. Tax collectors, then as perhaps now, were despised. They were looked at in the same way that we would look at certain professions even today. There were careers that today we would consider contemptible. And in those days, being a tax collector would fall into that category. It was a contemptible career. Now, as if to prove his righteousness, the Pharisee emphasized the good things that he did. He fasted twice on the Sabbath, not just once, twice. And he gave tithes of all that he possessed. Wow, on the surface, that's a great characteristics to have. Of and by themselves, these were good deeds, even if they were overdone. But when we publicize our good deeds, that's when there's a problem. Just as the Pharisees did. Besides being tacky, there are other issues as well. This attitude of pride is in contrast to the so-called despised tax collector. Notice his attitude in the next verse 13 of Luke 18. And standing afar off, the tax collector would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat on his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. It's quite a difference in contrast, quite a contrast for the Pharisees. The tax collector showed an attitude of humility. He knew he was a sinner. He knew he was not perfect. He knew he needed help. He was not after power and authority. He felt lowly, and rightly so, in the sense that he was a sinner and that he needed forgiveness from God. Contrast that with the attitude of Adonijah, who sought to take power and authority. He wanted that power. The tax collector did not, and that's the difference. One wanted power and authority and went after it, and the other did not. And then Luke 18, verse 14, coming back to what we read earlier. Luke 18, verse 14. Jesus continues with his parable. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself shall be abased, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted. So what's the lesson here? Well, basically, it's that power will come to those who don't seek it. If we humble ourselves before God and before others, we will be exalted. Those who go after the power, like Adonijah did, and the Pharisees did, will have their reward. Those who do not seek power, like the tax collector, will receive their reward as well. They will be exalted or elevated. Thinking that we're better than others is a sign of pride. It's easy to have that frame of mind, especially since we are called by God and have His Spirit. But rather than being filled with pride, we must be filled with humility instead. And that's the attitude that God looks for, and the attitude that He wants in us, that attitude of humility. Another lesson that we can learn from the Pharisees: if we criticize others, it leaves us open to criticism from others. If we criticize others, it leaves us open to criticism from others. Pharisees were good at criticizing others that they saw as being less than themselves, which was just about everyone else. The Pharisees showed many of the manifestations of pride. What are some of the manifestations of pride? How does pride show itself in our lives? Well, there are several things to look for. There are a number of things that we can look for as having a manifestation of pride. One of them is neglecting proper prayer, study, fasting, and meditation. Neglecting proper prayer, study, fasting, and meditation. That's one of the manifestations of pride. Not submitting to authority is another. Not submitting to authority. Not taking correction. Not taking correction is a manifestation of pride. Kind of going along with that is having a know-it-all attitude. having a know-it-all attitude, criticizing others. Criticizing others. Kind of goes hand in hand with that is thinking that you're better than anyone else. Thinking that you're better than anyone else. Impatience with others. Impatience with others is another manifestation of pride. And feeling a need to be right. Feeling a need to be right. How many of these manifestations of pride fit Adonijah? It's safe to say that he did not pray, study, fast, or meditate, certainly not in the proper way. He did not submit to authority. He saw himself as the authority. He did not take correction. He had a know-it-all attitude. He criticized others. He thought he was better than anyone else. He was probably impatient with others, and he felt a need to be right. Now, how many of these manifestations of pride fit the Pharisees? Did they properly pray, study, fast, and meditate? That doesn't appear that they did, certainly. Did they submit to authority? Not the proper authority. Did they take correction? No. Did they have a know-it-all attitude? Yes. Did they criticize others? Yes. Did they think that they were better than anyone else? Yes. Were they impatient with others? Quite probably. Did they feel a need to be right? Yes, they did. Now, if you were to ask the same questions of the tax collector, you'd probably get very different answers, almost the exact opposite. Now let's contrast those manifestations of pride with the attitude of Apollos. Acts chapter 18 and verse 24 through 28. Acts 18, verses 24 through 28. Acts 18, verse 24. And so let's look at this example and see what we can learn from it. Acts 18, verse 24. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogues. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately, or more fully, more completely. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. There are a number of things to note in these verses. In verse 24, it states that Apollos was an eloquent man. That means he was fluent. He knew the Scriptures well. We use the word fluent to describe someone who is able to speak, write, and understand a different language very well. Apollos was fluent in the Scriptures, so he knew the Scriptures very well. That came from praying, from studying the Word of God. He was mighty in the Scriptures, meaning that he was powerful or capable when it came to the Scriptures. He was mighty in the Scriptures. There's no sign of a know-it-all attitude here in Apollos at all. Verse 25 states that he was instructed in the way of the Lord. And that word instructed means sounded down into the ears. So it's not just, going in one ear and out the other. It's actually staying there. It's sounded down into the ears. Very nice way of putting it. It was part of his being. He was taught the way of God. The Scriptures were indoctrinated into his being. They were part of his life, part of him. He was fervent in spirit, it notes as well. Apollos was fervent in spirit. To be fervent means to be hot. As the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary points out, he burned to impart to others the truth that he himself had received. He burned to impart to others. He had a zeal to teach others what he had been taught. He was passionate about what he was teaching and about what he was being taught as well. Apollos spoke and taught the things of the Lord accurately or diligently. And diligently means exactly. He did not add to or take away from the Scriptures. In verse 26, Aquila and Priscilla heard him speak boldly. He spoke frankly. He spoke confidently. Notice that Aquila and Priscilla took him and explained to him the way of God more accurately or more exactly. Now, Apollos did not know everything when it came to the Scriptures, and his attitude indicated that he didn't pretend to know everything either. He indicated a willingness to learn more of God's way. Again, there was no sign of that know-it-all attitude in Apollos. In verse 28, it states that Apollos used the Scriptures to prove that Jesus is the Christ. So Apollos knew who was in charge. He knew who was in authority. And it certainly was not him. There are a number of things that we can learn from Apollos' example if we're willing to be taught accordingly. Apollos was willing to be taught. Does that apply to us? Are we willing to be taught? He knew he didn't know everything, and he wanted to learn more. He realized that he needed to learn more as well. Does that apply to us? Do we realize that we need to learn more? Do we want to learn more? We must also show that same desire to learn more that Apollos had. Apollos did not seek to become an apostle or a disciple. He did not seek to be in the spotlight. Of course, that is in direct contrast to Adonijah, who, as we remember, exalted himself to become king. He wanted that position. He took it upon himself. He wanted the authority that came with the position. He wanted that power. So the contrast between Adonijah and Apollos is rather striking when you look at it. Apollos wanted to learn more. Even though he already knew a lot about the Scriptures through prayer and study, but he knew that he didn't know everything. He could use more knowledge. He showed humility by his example. There are a number of powerful lessons that we can learn from Apollos and from his example. So what are the benefits, or some of the benefits, of having an attitude of humility like Apollos had? Let's take a look at this promise from God in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14. Notice the if-then statement that is shown in this verse. Verse 14, if my people, who are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. Those words should give us hope and comfort. Notice that again. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive them their sin and will heal their land. That's a very comforting statement. For our last scripture today, let's turn over to 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6. 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6 shows another benefit of humility. 1 Peter 5, verse 5, likewise, younger ones, be subject to older ones, and all being subject to one another. Put on humility, For God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Verse 6 continuing, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. So again, those words should give us great comfort. Likewise, younger ones, be subject to older ones, and all being subject to one another, put on humility. For God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. So God will elevate us in his time, if we do our part, which includes being humble. If we try to do that ourselves, that is, to lift up ourselves when we want to, we'll be like Adonijah. If we humble ourselves before others and before God, we'll be like the tax collector Jesus spoke of. And we'll be like Apollos that we read about earlier. And God will exalt us in his time. The Bible is filled with examples of pride and humility. Today we looked at 3 examples. That of Adonijah, the Pharisee and the tax collector, and Apollos. And there are many others that we could look at as well and learn from. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn from these 3 examples that we looked at? One lesson is that we must never put ourselves into positions of authority when we don't belong there. If we humble ourselves before God and before others, then we will be exalted. That's a promise that we can take to the bank. If we criticize others, it leaves us open to criticism from others as well. We must recognize proper authority. Authority that comes from God. We must never think that we know it all. Instead, we should be like Apollos, who showed a willingness to learn and a willingness to be taught. Let's recognize those manifestations of pride and learn to replace them with an attitude of proper humility that is pleasing to God. So in these 3 examples we looked at today, we saw some of the perils of pride and the honor of humility.